The air was thick with ash and gunpowder. Smoke curled through the skeletal remains of what had once been a small village nestled in the countryside of eastern Poland. Crumbled walls, scorched earth, twisted metal, and the silence that follows after the screaming stops. All of it lingered like a shadow. It was a kind of silence that came only after a massacre. Not peaceful, not gentle, just empty. In the midst of this devastation, barefoot and caked in soot, walked a boy. He was no older than 10, thin as a scarecrow. His clothes hung off a small frame in rags, stained with dirt, blood, and smoke. His name was Alexei, but no one called him that anymore. There was no one left to remember it. The boy stepped cautiously over a burned wooden beam, careful not to disturb the brittle rubble beneath his feet. His eyes scanned the landscape like an animal, alert, wary, quiet. Every noise made his muscles tighten. Every sudden breeze made his heart jolt. He was alone, truly alone. His parents gone. His sister. He had stopped calling her name 2 nights ago when he realized no one would answer. There were no tears left. Hunger had taken them first. Then came the fear. Now only instinct remained. He scavenged in the remains of a market stall. Rotten apples, a broken jar of honey, the melted edge of what might have once been a chocolate bar. Alexei pocketed it all mechanically, without hope, just survival. His stomach had learned to shrink. His heart had learned to harden. His hands had stopped trembling 2 days ago. Then he heard it, a sound, not a bird, not the wind, not distant artillery. This was closer, a groan, low, rough, and human. Alexei froze, his small fingers tightening around the piece of metal he'd been using as a makeshift knife. He turned slowly, eyes wide, and scanned the rubble. There was again, louder this time, pain laced into every note. Behind a collapsed wall, barely visible beneath a torn military coat and the remains of a burned-out signpost, lay a man, an enemy soldier. Alexei knew the uniform, green-gray heavy, with blood on one sleeve and a black insignia smeared with dirt. The man wasn't moving much. One leg was twisted unnaturally beneath him, and his rifle lay several meters away, half buried in ash. The boy's breath hitched. This man, this uniform, this side, they had destroyed everything. His village, his family, his world. The war had brought monsters wearing that same uniform, monsters who had shouted in foreign tongues and lit the sky on fire. He could leave. He could walk away. Or he could finish what the bombs hadn't. But then, something strange happened. The soldier turned his head. Their eyes met. Not for long. Just a second, maybe less. But that second cracked something inside Alexei that had long been sealed shut. The soldier didn't look like a monster. Not in that moment. His eyes weren't filled with hate. They weren't even angry. They were tired, terrified, lost. Alexei should have felt rage. Or fear. But instead, what rose in his chest was something else entirely. Confusion. Why wasn't he afraid? He stepped closer. Slowly. Careful not to make sudden moves. The soldier flinched. His hand twitched toward where his weapon would have been, but there was no strength left in his arm. He let it fall back down. The groan that escaped his throat was more animal than human. Alexei stopped a few feet away. Neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely carried a crackle of distant fires, Alexei asked, "Do you need help?" The man blinked. "What?" The boy took another step forward, his dirty face calm but curious. "Can you get up?" The soldier stared at him, stunned. For a long time he said nothing. Then his body began to shake. A tremor started in his shoulders and moved down his arms. Not from cold, but from something deeper. Tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. And just like that, this trained killer, this man who had marched with tanks and fire through towns just like this one broke. A sob escaped him, raw, unfiltered. He turned his face away, ashamed. Alexei didn't understand all of it. He didn't know what trauma looked like on an adult, but he saw the collapse. He saw that the man wasn't a soldier in that moment. He was just a person, broken, bleeding, alone. "Why are you helping me?" the soldier asked, barely above a whisper. Alexei shrugged. "I don't know." Silence. Then the boy crouched beside him, cautious but steady, and reached out his hand. The soldier stared at it like it was something sacred. He didn't move to take it. Not yet. He just looked at it, disbelieving. No orders, no violence, just a child's hand, extended toward him in a world that had forgotten kindness. In that burned and battered street, the war paused, not from a ceasefire, but from a question asked by a boy who had every reason to hate, and chose not to. Alexei kept his hand out, and the soldier slowly raised his own. The soldier's hand trembled as it met the boy's. It wasn't strength that moved his fingers, but desperation, the kind that came after a man had been stripped of everything but breath. Alexei's small, dirt-smeared hand closed around his. The boy tried to pull to help him sit up, but the soldier's weight collapsed back to the ground with a grunt of pain. His leg. Alexei's eyes dropped to it. The fabric was soaked in blood, twisted at an angle that didn't look natural. The soldier followed the boy's gaze and gave a bitter, breathless laugh. "Broken," he muttered. "I think it's broken." He spoke in an accent, Slavic, but not Polish. Alexei didn't know the difference. Not really. He only knew this man had come of the ones who had ruined his home. Yet here they were, two strangers, two survivors, locked in a moment that neither had expected to last this long. "What's your name?" the soldier asked. Alexei hesitated. For a second, it was as if the question hadn't registered. No one had asked him that since the sirens began. Not since the night he lost his mother's hand in the crowd. Not since everything changed. "Alexei," he said softly. The soldier nodded, wincing as he shifted slightly. "I'm Mikhail." Silence fell again. Only the wind moved now, whispering through the debris, rattling bits of tin and broken glass. Alexei stood. His eyes darted toward the empty street, then back to the wounded man. He didn't know why he stayed. There were no rules anymore. No adults to tell him what was right or wrong. And yet, leaving didn't feel right. He pointed at the soldier's leg. "You can't walk." Mikhail shook his head. Not without something to lean on. Maybe not at all. The boy looked around. Then, without a word, he walked off, disappearing into ruins. Mikhail's breath caught. "Wait!" But Alexei was already gone. The soldier slumped back against the brick wall, breathing hard. Pain pulsed through his thigh like fire, every beat of his heart echoing in the wound. He touched the blood-soaked fabric, then quickly withdrew his hand. He knew what could happen. Infection, shock, the body shutting down. He had seen it before on both sides. "Stupid," he whispered to himself. "Why didn't you just shoot?" But deep down he knew why, even if the boy had come with a weapon in hand. Mikhail didn't have the strength to lift his own anymore. He was spent, more than wounded. Something inside had already given up. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time didn't move the same way anymore. Then footsteps. Quick, light. Alexei reappeared, dragging something long and wooden behind him, a crooked beam, stripped of nails about the size of a walking stick. He dropped it beside the soldier and crouched down, panting. "You can use this." Mikhail stared at him, astonished. "You brought that for me?" Alexei didn't answer. He just picked up the soldier's arm, slid it over his narrow shoulders, and began to lift. It was awkward, clumsy. The man was nearly 3 times his size, and every attempt to raise him sent a jolt of agony through his injured leg. But the boy didn't give up. He grunted, adjusted his footing, and tried again. Finally, with a cry of pain and a groan of effort, Mikhail rose to one knee, then to his feet, wobbling against the wall. His face was pale, drenched in sweat. "Careful," Alexei muttered, steadying him with both arms. Mikhail leaned heavily on the beam. His breath was shallow. "You shouldn't be helping me," he said, voice hoarse. "Not after what we did." Alexei looked up at him, his expression unreadable. "I'm not helping you," he said. "I'm helping someone who can't walk." The words hung in the air. There was no rebuttal. The boy turned, guiding them through the ruins, past collapsed houses and burned-out cars. The sky had begun to darken again, not from nightfall, but from the smoke of something still burning in the distance. "Where are we going?" Mikhail asked. "Shelter," Alexei replied. There's a place where I sleep. It's hidden. The soldier didn't argue. He couldn't. Every step was torture, and Alexei's support was the only thing keeping him upright. They moved slowly, the sound of their progress swallowed by the broken city. Alexei led them through an alleyway, past the charred remains of school. He didn't look at it. Mikhail did. It was there, painted on one wall, barely visible beneath the soot. Handprints, small ones, in yellow and red. A child's drawing of the sun, beside them. The kind of thing he'd seen before, in places he never expected to fight. He closed his eyes. Was this your school? Alexei didn't answer. They reached a metal hatch buried beneath a collapsed shed. Alexei knelt and yanked it open, revealing a dark hole lined with old bricks. He had dragged blankets inside, stacked food scraps in a corner, even arranged broken furniture to block the entrance from view. Mikhail stared at it in disbelief. You made this? The boy shrugged. I found it, fixed it. Together, with effort, they descended. Inside, the air was cold and dry. Safe. For now. Mikhail slumped into the corner, groaning. Alexei offered him a filthy blanket and then, to his surprise, pulled out a cracked bottle of water. He handed it over wordlessly. The soldier drank. Then came the silence again. It wasn't uncomfortable, just full, as if both were waiting for something. After a while, Mikhail spoke. I had a brother, he said. He was your age when the war started. I haven't seen him since we left. Alexei didn't look at him. He stared at the wall. I had a sister, he replied. She was older. I think she's gone. Neither of them said anything after that. The war had taken so much. And now, inside a hidden hole in the earth, a boy and a soldier sat across from each other, two ghosts of the same tragedy. Above them, the sky groaned again, as another round of bombs echoed in the distance. But down here, for now, there was no side, no flag, no orders, only survival, and the fragile beginning of something neither of them dared name. Mikhail awoke with a start. He had dreamed of gunfire again, not the chaos of the battlefield, but something worse. Silence, then a single shot. In the dream, it was his brother's face he saw, pale, still, forgotten in some nameless ditch. He jolted upright, groaning as the pain in his leg snapped him back to present. The bunker was dimly lit by the early morning light, filtering through a small crack in the collapsed roof. Dust floated in the beam like silent snow. Alexei was already awake, sitting near the entrance, chewing on something hard and stale. When he noticed Mikhail stirring, he didn't speak. He just watched. The boy had learned early that silence was safer than sound. Mikhail wiped sweat from his forehead. His whole body ached. Fever was setting in. How long was I out? He croaked. Alexei shrugged. A day. Maybe more. You slept. The soldier tried to move, but the pain in his leg forced him to stop. His skin was hot to the touch. Infection. Of course. He'd known it was coming. Do you have anything? He asked. Medicine? Alexei looked down at the crumbs in his hand, then shook his head. No medicine. Just this. He reached into the shadows and pulled out a small cloth pouch. Inside, Mikhail could make out a few scavenged treasures. A candle stub, 2 buttons, a bit of string, and a rusted spoon. And there, a tiny, half-used tube of ointment. The boy held it out wordlessly. Mikhail blinked. You're giving me that? You need it, Alexei said, his voice flat. Mikhail took it slowly. He applied the cream with gritted teeth, smearing it over the angry, swollen wound on his thigh. It wouldn't be enough, but it was something. Why are you helping me? Mikhail asked again. The question had haunted him every hour in that dark place. Alexei paused. Then finally he said, because someone should... The words were simple, but they landed like a stone in the pit of Mikhail's chest. He turned away, ashamed. That night, the fever worsened. Mikhail drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he dreamed of home, a farm outside Kharkiv, with golden fields and the smell of bread in the morning. Other times he saw fire, faces screaming, buildings collapsing. But always, somewhere in the chaos, he saw Alexei, standing still while the world burned around him. At one point, during a haze of fever, Mikhail mumbled, "They made us believe we were heroes." Alexei, half asleep beside him, opened his eyes. "Were you?" Mikhail didn't answer. By the third day, the fever broke. He woke drenched in sweat, weak but clearer. Alexei had been watching over him the whole time, checking his breathing, feeding him bits of dry food, and keeping him from slipping too far into the darkness. "I thought you might die," Alexei said, not unkindly. "You made a lot of noise." Mikhail tried to smile. "Sorry. Don't be. You didn't scream too much." He chuckled, then winced. Laughter hurt, but it felt human. "You've taken care of me," Mikhail said, looking at the boy, "better than anyone else would have." Alexei looked away. "You're not better yet." "No," Mikhail admitted, "but I'm alive. Because of you." Silence again. Then Alexei asked, "What happens when you're better?" Mikhail froze. The question cut deep. He hadn't thought that far ahead. In truth, he had assumed he'd die in that hole, and the war would move on without him. But now that his mind was clearer, something else crept in. A plan, a question, a fear. "What do you think should happen?" he asked, voice low. Alexei stood, brushing dust off his knees. "You go back to your side. I stay here." Mikhail frowned. "Is that what you want?" The boy hesitated. "I don't want anything anymore." There was no bitterness in his voice, just emptiness. Later that day, Mikhail made an effort to stand. Alexei helped him, and though the pain was sharp, he managed to limp a few steps with the help of a makeshift crutch Alexei had reinforced with wire. "You're getting stronger," the boy observed. Mikhail nodded. "Thanks to you." They spent the day quietly, the boy scavenging nearby, Mikhail practicing standing. But both of them avoided talking about the next step, about the world outside the bunker, about the war that still raged just beyond the ruins. That night, Mikhail sat beside the entrance, staring at the stars through a broken gap in the roof. "I used to think people like you didn't matter," he said. Alexei didn't reply. "I was taught that civilians were just part of the cost, not targets, but not important either. Collateral." A long pause. Then Alexei said, "And now?" Mikhail turned to him. "Now I know that's what monsters think." The words hung between them. The next morning, Alexei returned from a supply run looking shaken. He burst into bunker, eyes wide, voice urgent. "They're close." Mikhail stiffened. "Who?" "Your side. Soldiers. I saw their tracks. Their gear." He paused. "They're searching." Mikhail's heart pounded. He hadn't heard any nearby gunfire. No shouting. But if a unit was sweeping the area, it was only a matter of time before they found the shelter. "We have to go," Alexei said. "They'll kill you." Mikhail blinked. "I'm one of them." "Not anymore," the boy said firmly. "You're injured. You're missing. They'll think you deserted. Or they'll ask what happened. And if they find me—" He cut himself off. Mikhail understood. He grabbed the crutch and stood. Alexei was already gathering the little supplies they had. The tin can, the pouch, the old blanket. He handed Mikhail the rest of the ointment. "Where will we go?" Mikhail asked. Alexei didn't look up. "I know another place. Farther out." Mikhail stared at him. "You'd run with me?" The boy didn't answer right away. Then he said simply, "Yes." No hesitation. Just that. They stepped into the light together. A soldier and a boy, not enemies, not allies. Just two people trying to outrun a world that had lost its soul. The ruins no longer felt empty. They were being watched. Alexei felt it first, that quiet tension in the air, like a string pulled too tight. The soldiers' tracks hadn't been hard to spot earlier that morning, leading through ash and shattered stone. Whoever had followed them was trained, methodical. Mikhail confirmed it with a grim nod. "Recon team," he muttered, scanning the rooftops with practiced eyes. "They'll call the others and when they're sure." "How much time do we have?" Alexei asked. Mikhail didn't answer. That told the boy everything. They moved fast. Mikhail limping with the crutch, Alexei scouting the path ahead. The child moved like a shadow, quick and careful, weaving through half-collapsed buildings and scorched alleyways. Mikhail followed as best he could, sweat pouring down his face with every painful step. His leg throbbed, but he pushed forward. They cut through what had once been a bakery. Loaves of ash still lined the blackened shelves, and the smell of soot clung to everything. Alexei paused just long enough to grab a rustic can of food from wreckage. They kept moving. Every now and then, Mikhail would glance over his shoulder, eyes searching the rooftops. He saw nothing, but he felt them, wolves in uniform, hunting their own. Alexei led them through a drainage tunnel, crawling on hands and knees through sludge and darkness. When they emerged, coughing and slick with filth, they found themselves on the outskirts of the village, where nature had begun to reclaim what man had destroyed. Tall grass, cracked fences, the broken skeleton of a barn. Alexei pointed. There. It was barely visible. A narrow stone shack hidden behind wild vines and ivy. It looked abandoned, forgotten, but the boy had been there before. They slipped inside. It was dark and cold, but dry. The roof had holes. The floor was cracked, but it felt safer. For now. Mikhail dropped to the ground with a heavy breath, crutch clattering beside him. Alexei knelt and quickly began checking the soldier's leg. "You're bleeding again," he said. "I'm always bleeding," Mikhail muttered with a weak smile. Alexei didn't return it. He tore a strip from his own shirt and began wrapping the wound again, tighter this time. Mikhail winced but didn't stop him. "You didn't have to come with me," the soldier said quietly. "You could have run. Hid. You still can." Alexei finished the knot and sat back on his heels. "I'm not leaving." "Why?" Mikhail asked. The boy looked at him, eyes steady. "Because if they find you and I'm not there, they'll kill you, and you'll die alone." There was no fear in his voice, just a calm certainty, a strange, heavy maturity no 10-year-old should ever carry. Mikhail's throat tightened. This child, who had lost everything because of his people, was risking what little he had left for him. The silence stretched between them, filled with things they didn't have the words for. Then Alexei spoke again. "They killed my father," he said softly, "in the square. They made us watch. My sister," she ran toward him. "They shot her too." Mikhail closed his eyes. "I was hiding," the boy continued, "behind the door. I didn't move. I didn't even cry. After it was over, I waited until night. Then I buried them." His voice didn't break. There were no tears left. Mikhail reached out, placing a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "I'm sorry." Alexei stared at the ground. "I thought I'd hate forever. But you didn't," Mikhail said. The boy shook his head. "Not when I saw you. Bleeding. Alone. You weren't a soldier anymore. You were just like me." Mikhail swallowed hard. He looked away. He didn't deserve this forgiveness. Not from him. Not from anyone. But he'd been given it anyway. That night, the sound came. Boots. Crunching gravel. Slow. Careful. Alexei was the first to hear it. He shook Mikhail awake, finger to his lips. The soldier sat up fast, grabbing his crutch, straining to listen. Then a voice. Foreign. Barking orders. They were close. Alexei motioned toward the back of the shack, a gap beneath the collapsed wall. "A way out." Mikhail nodded. They moved silently. Alexei slipped out first, then reached back to help Mikhail. But the soldier froze. He saw them. 2 soldiers. Flashlights. Just outside. "No time." Alexei hissed, "Now!" But Mikhail turned, breath catching. If he moved, they'd hear. He looked at the boy, at the small face smeared with soot, the eyes that had once been full of fear, now only watching him, waiting to know what to do. Then Mikhail made a choice. He stood, loudly. The flashlight swung toward him instantly. Shouts followed. Alexei's heart stopped. "What are you doing?" Mikhail didn't answer. He stepped into the doorway, hands raised. "I'm unarmed," he shouted. "Don't shoot." Alexei crouched behind the wall, eyes wide, frozen. The soldiers rushed forward. Their guns were up. "Sergeant Mikhail Volkov?" one barked. "Is that you?" Mikhail nodded. "Yes." The second soldier frowned. "You're alive?" Mikhail's mouth was dry. "Wounded. Alone." They lowered their rifles slowly. One of them stepped closer. "You've been missing for weeks." "We thought." "I was ambushed. I lost everything." "And the boy?" the soldier asked. Mikhail's stomach turned. "What boy?" Alexei closed his eyes. He heard it, the lie. A clean one. Instinctive. To protect. The soldier hesitated. "We tracked you. Saw footprints. 2 sets." "I've been hallucinating," Mikhail replied, still standing in the doorway. "Fever. I might have imagined someone." A long silence. Then, "We need to move. It's not safe here." They reached for him. Mikhail turned just slightly, his eyes locking with Alexei's, still hidden in the dark. A moment passed. A nod. A silent goodbye. Then Mikhail turned away and walked back toward the war. The shack was quiet again. Alexei waited in the darkness long after the soldiers were gone. He didn't move, didn't breathe too loudly. The silence that returned wasn't the same as before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even safety. It was absence. It was the space Mikhail had left behind. The boy crouched there, staring at the gap in the wall where he had last seen the soldier. His chest hurt, not from running or from hunger, but from something he couldn't name, something that wrapped around his ribs and pressed down. Mikhail was gone. Alexei knew he had chosen it, that he had lied, that he had protected him, and still it felt like losing something again. Another person disappearing into the war. Another goodbye without words. 3 days passed. Alexei stayed hidden, moved only at night, drank rainwater, ate the last of the canned food. There were no more soldiers. The sweep had ended. He didn't know if Mikhail had gone back to his unit, or if he'd been taken elsewhere. He didn't know if they believed him, or they found out the truth later. He just knew the soldier hadn't betrayed him, and that should have been enough. But it didn't feel like it. It was on the 4th day that Alexei returned to the place where he'd first found him, the rubble-strewn corner of the village where their stories had crossed. Nothing remained. The same blood-stained coat still lay on the ground where Mikhail had crawled that day, stiff with dirt and dried blood. Alexei crouched beside it and slowly picked it up, folded it, sat with it in his lap. He remembered the moment they locked eyes, the hesitation, the choice. Alexei didn't understand war. Not really. He didn't know the names of the countries involved, or what had started it, or who claimed to be winning. All he knew was that it took everything. Except this. Except the one moment that no one could take away. 2 weeks passed. Then came the whisper, a rumor from a traveling merchant passing through the ruins. A man in uniform had been arrested by his own side for insubordination. They said he'd lied to his officers, hidden information. He was being transported. Quietly. No trial. No explanations. Alexei's heart pounded as the words reached him. He followed. It took days of walking, hiding, and listening to strangers talk. But eventually, he reached the edge of a war-torn city where the transport trucks were stopped for the night. He kept low to the ground, crawling between shadows, until he found it. A caged truck, covered, guarded by 2 men with rifles. Inside, only one prisoner. He saw the silhouette sitting on the floor, head down, arms bound. Alexei's breath caught. It was him. Mikhail. He hadn't died, but he wasn't free either. That night, under the cover of darkness and smoke, Alexei made his choice. He waited until the guards swapped shifts, crept beneath the vehicle, and slipped inside through a rusted panel at the back. He moved silently, slowly, like a cat that had done this all before. Mikhail didn't look up at first. Only when Alexei placed a hand on his shoulder did he raise his head, and his eyes widened. "Alexei." The boy smiled faintly. "You're bad at disappearing." Mikhail looked at him, stunned. "What are you doing here? You should be gone. Far away." "I didn't want to owe you," Alexei replied, his voice low. "You saved me. Now it's even." He pulled a knife from his sleeve, a dull, bent thing he'd stolen days earlier, and began sawing at the bindings on Mikhail's wrists. The soldier stared at him, disbelief painted across his bruised face. "You came back for me?" Alexei didn't answer. He just kept cutting. Finally, with a snap, the ropes fell away. Mikhail groaned, rubbing his wrists, wincing. "We have 10 minutes," Alexei whispered. "Maybe less." They slipped out the back of the truck and into the alley, moving quickly through ruined streets, Mikhail limping but not hesitating. Alexei had prepared a route. He knew the city better than he should. A hole in the fence. An abandoned train station. By the time the alarm sounded, they were gone. Months passed. Seasons changed. The war dragged on, louder in some places, quieter in others. But Alexei and Mikhail were no longer part of it. They crossed borders with forged documents, hid in freight trains, traded scraps for rides. One night, under a cold sky in Slovakia, they sat by a fire in a forest clearing and ate bread shared by a kind stranger. Mikhail was thinner, slower, but alive. Alexei had grown quieter, but his eyes burned with the same fire. He watched the stars. "What are you thinking?" Mikhail asked. The boy turned to him. "That night," he said, "in the bunker, when I asked what happens next." Mikhail nodded. Alexei looked at the fire. "I think this is better." Years passed. In a small town near the Austrian border, there was a mechanic shop run by a man with a slight limp. He never talked about the war. Most people didn't ask. He was kind to the local children, never turned away someone hungry, laughed easily, but always carried something heavy behind his eyes. Sometimes a quiet teenager helped him at the shop, quick with tools, quicker with silence. No last name, just Alexei. They never told anyone their story. They didn't have to. The world had already heard too many stories of death. This one, they kept for themselves. A boy who lost everything, and the soldier who should have been his enemy, but wasn't. And in that ruined place where the war tried to end them both, they found something no weapon could destroy. A choice.